Hello, Helen.
Hello, how are you?
I'm sorry, we just had a session, and unfortunately, we were not bright enough to have another account.
No problem, don't worry.
When you're doing a couple of things, and there are some things bound to, we didn't figure, and most of the sessions have had a gap. Unfortunately, your session did not have a gap, and
No
we
problem
didn't
at
think
all.
of another account. So there, hurrah, we're finding something for the next time. So thank you so much, Helen. I'm going to introduce you to Mavish. You can see her right there, Mavish Raza, and she's going to introduce you and start your session. But I'll quietly mute out, but listen to what you have to say, because I'm sure this is one of the most powerful sessions that we are going to conduct, and it's a new addition to our research methodology course, and I think an area that has not been much explored. So we are very, very excited to have you. So over to you, Mavish. Helen is all yours.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much and welcome, Helen.
Thank
So the
you.
format of this webinar is going to be like we are going to play a short video, only 4 minutes long, to introduce this course. And after that, my colleague Gohar is going to take us through the netiquettes for this session. And then, of course, we'll leave the floor to you. But before I ask Gohar to play that video for the audience, I'd like to introduce our resource person. You have heard her name, Dr. Helen Beckett. Welcome, Dr. Helen Beckett. She is the Professor of Social Policy and Social Work at the Connect Center for International Research on Interpersonal Violence and Harm at University of Central Lancashire, UK. She has a PhD in anthropography of youth homelessness from the Queen's University of Belfast. She's an experienced researcher and policy analyst specializing in sexual violence, abuse, child protection, and children's rights. And today's session is dedicated to ensuring researchers' well-being. We as researchers also need to be mindful of our own well-being to produce high-quality research. We were talking about some aspects related to the researchers' individual well-being in our previous webinar, where experts had shared tips to to grow stronger as a researcher. And one of the tips that emerged is how to keep a balance between regular life and research, how to break the researcher's block, the writer's block, and how to overcome these issues through developing habits and fostering your own personal well-being. So thank you so much, Helen. Again, I'm looking forward to your session. Before we leave the floor for you, I would request Gohar to take us through the netiquettes and run the video very quickly. Yeah, thank you.
Hello everyone, I'll quickly go over the netiquettes for the session. You're all requested to please rename your Zoom accounts to the name of your university first and then your name afterwards. Regardless you're joining through YouTube or through Zoom, please make sure that you add your credentials to the certificate form because this is the only way we'll be sharing the certificates for the session. And please note that a minimum of 8 to 12 working days are required for the certification. And these sessions will be recorded and all these recordings will be added to the CLT repository, the CLT YouTube channel for free access. If you're not subscribed yet, please subscribe. That's it from our side. Over to you, Dr. Helen.
Thank you very much. It's really lovely to be here with you today and to take some time to think about researcher well-being. I'm just going to check and see if I can share my slides. I'm not used to Zoom, so give me 1 second, and if not, I will ask you to share it if there's a problem with me doing it.
Sure, you have the co-host rights and you should be able to share your slides. I'll give you a thumbs up if we see your slides. Yeah, we do see your screen. You just have to enter the slideshow mode.
Is that it now? Is it on the slideshow mode now? Sorry.
Not yet.
Oh, okay. It is on my screen. Give me 1 second. I wonder if it's easier. Do you have the slides to hand to share? Sorry, I know we didn't get a chance to check it. I'm not used to Zoom.
We could see your slides, and there on the bottom right corner, you can run the slideshow. So we could see.
But it's coming up as running for me, but not for you. Can you see the slides okay if I do it the way that you could see it there? Yeah, let's just go with that then.
Perfect. You can go ahead like that. It's all right.
Great. Well, it's really lovely to have some time to think about researcher well-being with you today, and I'm delighted that you've introduced this new element to the course because it's such an important part of our work that we very often forget about. So I suppose just want to briefly run through the plan for today. We're particularly focusing on thinking about our well-being as researchers, our mental and emotional health, when we're engaging with sensitive or emotionally challenging topics. And although I've titled this Researcher Wellbeing, this also applies to the broader research community, so to people who manage, supervise, transcribe, arrange things. It's really important that we think about everybody's well-being when we're thinking about this. And what I want to do today really is think a little bit about the ways in which our health can be impacted, but also then how can we support this at an individual level, at a team level, and in our institutions. And I suppose rather than talk about this as an abstract concept, what I'm going to do is share some practical examples, some practical tips, and then I'm going to introduce you to a model that has been developed by colleagues at the University of Bath in the United Kingdom, which is around supporting universities and institutions to improve their responses to researcher wellbeing. And then we'll have a little bit of time for reflections and questions at the end. So I suppose just to kick off, the terminology of sensitive and emotionally challenging topics is a really big one, and it incorporates lots of different topics. And what is experienced as sensitive or emotionally challenging is different for all of us. It's impacted by our experiences and what we bring to the work. So when we're thinking about this, we never define it. We never say, here's a list of topics that are emotionally challenging or sensitive, but we recognize that it's about how the topic is experienced by the person who's working on it. So it's really important to remember that this means different things to different people. And what I'm going to do today is draw on my experience. I've been conducting research or involving children and young people in research for over 25 years now. around issues of abuse, disadvantage, and discrimination. And certainly have had my own well-being impacted as part of working in this field for so long. But I also, both in my current university and my previous university, run a research centre of people who are working on interpersonal violence and abuse. So I also come at it from the perspective of thinking about how do we support other people who are working on this, as well as thinking about our own well-being. And I mentioned in the last slide there, Tina Skinner, who has developed the model around this that I'm going to share at the end. And Tina and a couple of others and I set up a network of people who are working on researcher well-being to connect together and to support people to try to bring these issues forward in their institution. So I'm drawing on these kind of three elements of my experience today. It's important to say that my work is primarily UK and Ireland based, and I'm aware that we have people joining us from a wide range of countries today. So I hope there is transferable learning, but think about what I share, what that means in your context, because it may land slightly differently or the response may need to look slightly different. And as I say, I suppose my motivation for why I work on this topic, why I'm passionate about this topic, is that I have been personally impacted over the years, including kind of very significant impacts at times of my career working in this field when there hasn't been the right support around it, but also just kind of really passionate about supporting other people, and that we really open up a conversation about this and stop kind of pretending that it doesn't happen, that we're not impacted by our work, but we think about how do we actually do this better. So just, I suppose, a very brief kind of note at the start. I'm not going to share any details about the nature of my work, but I am going to talk about kind of the impact of working in difficult fields. So just a wee note to kind of about self-care as we go through this topic. If you need to kind of step out, have a little bit of time away, that's fine. But also give yourself a little bit of time afterwards to process some of the stuff that we have talked about today. So the context, why are we even thinking about this as a topic? Well, working on, for me, the field of child abuse, for other people, different kinds of emotionally challenging topics, it is an absolute privilege, but there's no doubt it can come at a personal cost. The work, when we work on things that we're passionate about, that we care about, that we know needs to change, it is natural that that can impact on us, and it can have a cost on our own well-being. And as I mentioned earlier, we all bring our own biographies and our experiences into this work that interact with our topics that we work on, whether that be that we have our own lived experience of the topic, or we know someone else who has been affected by it, or possibly actually just the scale of the topic in our countries. All of this interacts with we bring to the work. And I have a note here that these aren't static. And I think this is also really important to bear in mind. There's no, oh, great, I've got it sorted. I know how to manage my well-being now. I've got all my systems in place. This will do me for the rest of my career. It would be lovely if it was that simple, but that's not the case. When things change in our life, we can actually then experience our work in a very different way. And in my field of researching around child abuse, one of those really obvious ways is actually when someone becomes a parent. The coping mechanisms that they had and their ability to work in the field suddenly don't seem to work anymore because they experience it very differently as a parent. So it's being aware that as our life changes, as things change, we need to just keep on top of how does this impact us and what support do we need. And even though if we look at the work that I'm sure lots of you are doing and lots of other people are doing, we are hearing really traumatic accounts of really difficult experiences that people have gone through. And we hear that and we hold it. But actually, as researchers, we often don't have anywhere to go with it. And other roles like counsellors or in the
Excuse
UK.
me, Dr. Beckett, I'm really sorry to interrupt, but
Yeah.
your slides are not moving on the screen. Even
Oh,
without the slideshow mode, I think you're going ahead in your presentation, but we can just see the title slide. So if
Okay.
it's all right, can we play it from our end?
Yeah,
Would
that
that
would be
work for
great.
you?
Yeah, it's coming up as moving on for me. Sorry about that.
Okay. Could you please identify which slide were you on? Where should we play it from?
Yeah, if you go to the slide called context.
Context. There we are. Thank you so
Perfect.
much. Carry
No
on.
problem. Sorry about that. So in lots of other roles, we recognize that actually people need support and supervision to be able to manage the impact of this work. But it's very rare that anybody thinks about this in the context of research. If we could just go to the next slide then, please. And there is, of course, some transferable learning from working around kind of emotionally challenging topics in other fields. But actually, I think the research experience is quite unique, and some of the challenges that we face as researchers are quite unique. So, for example, in our research, we aren't there going on a journey with someone like we might be if we were engaging with them as a counsellor, where they come, they start in a difficult place, but we're able to go on a journey with them, and we're able to see them end up in a different place. Sometimes our research encounters, we only see someone once or a couple of times, and we maybe just hear about the worst of something, and we don't actually see them go on kind of a healing or a restorative journey after that. And actually, it can be really difficult to know kind of that someone has kind of shared this really difficult stuff with you, that they've had this really difficult experience, and then to walk away and actually not know what happens afterwards. How are they 6 months later? How has their life panned out? We don't get to see these things. And I think one of the other real challenges that's quite unique to research is our role as researchers is not to challenge what someone says, it's to understand their perspectives about stuff. And so, about 15 years ago, I did a piece of research on gang associated sexual violence. And I found that really difficult because I was hearing attitudes that were very offensive. And I really wanted to kind of go, I wanted to jump in and I wanted to say, oh, that's not how we should talk about women. That's not how we should do things. But that wasn't my role as a researcher. And if I had jumped in and done that, I wouldn't have heard all the other stuff they went on to tell me, which was really important for me to understand what was lying beneath those attitudes, to try to think about how we can change those attitudes. So it's this really quite unique tension in research where we can hear things, we have to just kind of take them in, and then we walk away and we don't know what's happened. So it's so important that we think about how do we support ourselves, our teams, our colleagues when we're working on this. And although there's lots of kind of one-line references in ethical documents and things like that about the importance of researcher well-being, there's actually very little has been done on this until recent years. And it's only kind of the last, particularly 3 to 5 years, that people have really started to grapple with this. But we've still a long way to go. And what we actually see is that a lot of the momentum around the importance of thinking about our well-being as researchers is coming from the ground up. It's coming from researchers who are saying this work has an impact and we need to have change. So what we want is we want to build that momentum of raising kind of this challenge, but we want institutions, funders, organizations to come on board and take responsibility for supporting us around this. Okay, next slide, please. So we don't have time to go into all of the things that can impact our well-being as researchers, but there's lots of practical concerns, and you can see some of the examples here, particularly in my field around engaging children in research about abuse. There's concerns that it's too sensitive a topic to talk to children about, or the children are too vulnerable to talk about it. And that can cause a real anxiety in us as researchers. You know, we can be worried about our performance. Have I said the wrong thing? That was really insensitive. Lots of things that can really weigh on us. One of the big ones, often when you're working with children and young people particularly, is working out what constitutes a breach of confidentiality. So what you have to pass on as opposed to what you can keep within the research context. And I've had many a conversation with a researcher phoning me going, this has just happened, I don't know, what should I do? And there's a real weight with that because you want to make sure you handle it correctly. And as I said about, we can hear these really difficult or traumatic accounts of people's lives, or these really offensive attitudes that actually kind of really make us have an internal struggle and a reaction when they happen. Participants can get upset. That often happens when you're working on emotionally challenging topics. And you can really struggle with feeling that you have upset somebody, or not being able to fix things or change things for someone. And I think this talks a little bit to what you said in the introduction, the not being able to switch off. The number of times over my career when I wake at night thinking about the participant that I've met that day, or 3 weeks later, it randomly comes into my head again in the middle of the night. So if we don't have opportunities to process this, we can really struggle to kind of find boundaries and find a way to switch off and maintain that really important balance of our work is important, we're passionate about it, we want to do it, but we are important as well as individuals, and we need to kind of be supported and sustained to work in difficult fields. Next slide, please. Great. So I don't want to spend too long on the detail of this, but suffice to say, this growing body of attention to this over the last 3 to 5 years, there have been lots of small-scale studies, but that keep telling us the same things, that researchers end up completely burnt out. They can have secondary or vicarious trauma, and by that I mean trauma as a result of being exposed to somebody else's trauma. Or for people who have lived experience of what they're researching, we can end up re-traumatized, some of our own experience being brought up again by what we're researching in the field. And there's lots of practical impacts that have been documented in research around this. Really negative emotions or distressing thoughts, and those circular thoughts sometimes that we just can't get out of our heads. Avoiding things that actually then we associate with uncomfortable feelings or distress. And that can sometimes even mean avoiding kind of really healthy parts of our life, but because we've got some association with, I did a really difficult interview. I went and met my friend that night. I now associate meeting my friend with how I felt around that. So it can really ripple into lots of parts of our life. We can end up disconnected from important people, from family, from friends, from ourselves, from our own emotions. We can end up with a changed worldview, particularly in my field around child abuse and interpersonal and gender-based violence. We can see danger everywhere. We can think that the world is, we can solely view it through a negative lens and miss the other things that are also true. And we can actually relive other people's experiences. So the difficult traumatic accounts that we've heard, we can feel as if we're going through that ourselves. And understandably can feel completely overwhelmed by our work. I imagine many of us have had that experience at some time. And it can also have, as well as these kind of more kind of mental and emotional well-being impacts, it can really impact our physical health. I'm not sure if people, how much you know about this, but there's a big body of research around the connection between the mind and body, and how when we don't process trauma, it gets stored in our bodies physically, and actually we can experience it as physical pain, as illness, of lots of other things. And also the research shows that it has a real impact on our careers. People can end up kind of leaving a career because it's just too difficult. And this is the important bit, it's too difficult in the absence of appropriate support. Not that it's too difficult full stop, but that without the right support, it's too difficult. And the research shows people end up leaving careers, totally changing fields, because it isn't sustainable in the absence of support. Next slide, please. So the research suggests that actually these impacts are kind of more acutely experienced by some researchers compared to others The slide hasn't moved on for me there. If you could, yeah, perfect. So the research would say, particularly if you're newer to the field, so doctoral research students, early career research students, that actually they can experience these impacts really acutely. Also, those with lived experience, either of what they're working on or an associated type, for example, of violence or harm, it can mean that we experience these things more acutely. But the really important thing to bear in mind here is it is absolutely not just restricted to early career researchers or those with lived experience. The research shows that all of us, across all stages of our careers, across a wide range of subject areas, across a wide range of methodologies, experience these negative impacts on our mental, emotional, and physical well-being as a result of our work. And in fact, it can actually have a cumulative impact over time in the absence of appropriate support. So sometimes those of us who've been working in the field longer may actually be even more impacted because it's building on all of the previous experiences of not having had the appropriate support. And as I say, it's across a whole range of methodologies. I talk about doing interviews because a lot of my work is qualitative, but I remember someone sharing when I was presenting who did just solely quantitative work and worked with really big data sets. But so they didn't see the detail of any abuse, but they were completely floored by just constant exposure to the scale of the problem. So there are different ways in which this can impact us. And actually, one of the things we very often forget about is it also can really impact us during analysis and reporting. And in fact, I find that kind of analysis stage, that I find that more difficult than when I am out doing fieldwork. Because when I'm doing fieldwork, I'm focusing on the child in front of me. I can see the person, I'm worrying about their well-being. So I'm managing the impact on me. But then when I sit later on, and I see in black and white in front of me on my screen the account of what they've just told me, that can sometimes really floor me. So it's really important that we think about this from all aspects, kind of start to end of the research process. And in fact, not just end of the research process, because sometimes it impacts us even more when the project is over and we finally have a sense of space to then kind of really experience the impacts that there have been on us. Next slide, please. So what do we need to do? Well, I fundamentally believe that we have to change the conversation. So when I train on this topic, the number of people who say to me, well, I did eventually tell my manager or my supervisor that this work was having an impact and I was struggling. And they said the response they got was some version of, well, maybe this isn't the right career for you. No, absolutely not. The response should be, what support do we need to put in place? Because it is natural that you're impacted by this work. So this has traditionally been seen as an individual problem. It's a researcher's inability to cope. And in fact, being told that, oh, well, the reason you're struggling is it's because you can't handle it, actually makes the impact even worse. It just keeps that vicious cycle going. If you can just hit, sorry, I have animations, so these are coming up one at a time. If you just hit return. We need to reframe the conversation to recognize that it is absolutely natural to react to what we hear and what we see. And we need to plan on the basis of expecting our work to impact us, expecting us to need support to manage those impacts. And that is, yes, part of that is about us and recognizing the impact on us and what helps us. And we'll think about that in a minute. But this isn't for individual researchers to solve. There is a collective responsibility for managing this across kind of researchers, managers, supervisors, ethics committees, funders, our institutions. We all have a role to play in this. And if institutions are employing or bringing people in to work on emotionally challenging topics, as a PhD, for example, they have a duty of care to provide support around this. If you just do one more return, there's a last point. But apart from this duty of care, we also need to recognize that there are so many benefits to investing in researcher well-being and doing it early on. It it's really important for research participants, because when I'm in a difficult place, when I'm struggling with what I've kind of been hearing and seeing, I am not in the good emotional place to support my research participants and to worry about their well-being, because actually I'm not in a good enough place myself. And so it means that I'm more likely to spill out. My emotion may more likely come out in the interview rather than be focused on them. It also sustains research careers. I've been doing this over 25 years. The radical difference it has made for me over the last 10 years, when we have started to put structures in place to support this, it sustains us to keep going. And it also just really supports a kind of a healthy and vibrant research culture where we research important things and we support each other to do that well and to make a difference around really important issues. Next slide there, please. So how do we start? Well, if you feel able, start the conversation. This is why I do things like this. It is so, and it's why it's wonderful you have this session. Let's start the conversation. Let's recognize that this happens, and let's lead by example about sharing that. So I guess for me, at the later stages of my research career, being in my secure professorship, it is easier for me to say this work has an impact than it is for a doctoral student or someone who's just starting out, who's worried that someone might judge them if they say these things. So those of us who can, let's lead by example, start the conversation. Let's actually think about the potential impacts of our work. When we're designing studies, when we're planning studies, think in the same way we think so carefully about participant well-being, and that is so important to do. Let's have a parallel process where we actually think about, how might this impact me? When might this impact me? What support might I need? And it's really important that we do that in a really kind of flexible way, because there is no one-size-fits-all reaction to working on emotionally difficult topics. And there's no one-size-fits-all response. If that gang-associated research that I talked about earlier, one of my colleagues came out and she just cried and cried and cried after her interview. She's happy for me to share this. And she was like, oh, I'm really struggling with this. But that was really healthy for her. The crying allowed her to get it out of her system. But other people might have been very worried about her because she was crying. Meanwhile, when I get impacted, I emotionally shut down, which is a little harder to see. So actually, she was having the healthier reaction and being able to process it, whereas I was shutting down and internalizing it all. So it's really important that we don't kind of expect people to react in one way, but we recognize that this can look very different for different people, and what they need might also be different. And as I said earlier, think about all stages of the process. Transcription, reading transcripts can be a really difficult time. And it is really important to prepare. And it is really important to say, I actually think that I might find doing an interview particularly difficult. I'd rather do a focus group with someone else there who's happy, who can manage it with me. So you can do some of that predicting. But it's also really important to recognize that sometimes things just completely come from left field and floor you, no matter how much preparation you've done. And it's often not the thing you expect. So a practical example on an earlier piece of research I did around children's experiences of sexual exploitation, I was reading kind of social care case files. And I had read a lot of them, and they'd had a lot of detail about what had happened to the children. And all my coping mechanisms were working okay. I was managing. And then I go in this one day, and it's a really slim file that has hardly any detail about what's happened. So in my head, I'm thinking this one will be easier to manage. This won't impact me. And on page 1, I read that the child is celiac, which is an inability to eat gluten, which is what I have too. And suddenly I go to pieces. So my usual coping mechanisms completely went, because something caught me off guard that I wasn't expecting. And suddenly it felt much more real, because there was that association of something totally different, food related, in my life. So we need to plan as best we can, try to anticipate our reactions, but also know that sometimes we'll be completely caught off guard. And that's where we're going to think about the importance of the support structures that are there for us when that happens. If we can just go to the next slide. So, tip number 1, pay attention to the practicalities. It is so much easier to manage the impact and the emotion of our work when we're not worrying about performance or practicalities. So even now, over 25 years into doing research with children and young people, I practice on every project. As a team, we practice doing our interviews. We scenario plan. One of us will kind of practice getting upset so we can see how we respond. So do that practicing with your colleagues so you're feeling less kind of exposed and unprepared when you're out in the field. Practically think about the scheduling of your work. How many interviews you're doing in a day. Not ending one and going straight into the next when you've no time to process it in between. Allowing for travel delays so you're not running completely stressed to arrive in to meet with someone. Building in downtime. Think about these practical things and think about just these little moments you can give yourself in the middle of them. And really importantly, plan time to process afterwards. One of the things we introduced at my last research centre, which we all found so helpful, is emotional debriefs at the end of a day of fieldwork, or it could be at the end of a day of transcription or analysis. And that's literally, say I'm out doing interviews, there is another member of staff who knows I'm there, who's on call, and who is expecting me to check in at the end of the day with them. Not just to say I'm physically safe home, those things we think about, but to just, they'll go, how you doing after the day's work? And we don't share the detail because we want to obviously honour participants' contributions. But it is an opportunity to just say, yeah, do you know what? Actually, I had one interview this afternoon that I just can't get it out of my head. It's going round in a loop. So it's that space, build it in actively, that space to have a space to process the impact of your work, the impact of, I just had to walk away from the transcription. It just was getting too much for me. So plan in that time that we have that support. And also make sure when you are, for example, doing fieldwork with participants, make sure there's support for them, because that leaving them if they've got upset or actually not knowing what's happened, it's really helped by knowing there is someone else picking that up. It helps you get those boundaries and know that there is somebody else there caring for them. You can focus on what you need as well. And I have here, remember your limitations. When we're in as researchers, we're not there as counsellors or therapists. So where you can, partner with other people who know your participants, who can provide that wraparound support. Okay, next slide, please. So very briefly at the couple of levels. At an individual level, we can't expect our managers, supervisors, institutions, to do all of this when we don't kind of give them what they need to be able to support us. So kind of know yourself. What is your go-to reaction? I talked about my time to get worried about me is when I start emotionally shutting down. Time to get worried about my colleague is when she starts crying a lot. Think about that yourself. Who is there in your life that knows you well enough to note your concerns? My husband will notice before I do that actually, hold on, you might be needing a little bit of a break or a little bit of support around this, because sometimes others can see it before we do. Now, obviously, that comes with a fear of we don't want to burden other people. My husband doesn't work in my field. I'm not going to share the detail of what I do. But the person can still just look out for changes in you, that they're able to say, how are you doing? Do you need a little bit of support? And just think about what helps you. What in your wider life? Is it going out for a run? Is it art? Is it being out in nature? Building in these things to help us while we're doing research. If you just hit return, there's another couple of points there. And one of the things I really encourage people to do, if you feel safe and able to do this, is identify a supervisor, a manager, a colleague. Who do you feel safe with? And actually give them permission to look out for you. So I am really blessed in each of my places to have someone who I can say, look, if you see this starting to happen, will you just check in with me? and check, am I okay? And do I need support? But from a human resources perspective, managers need kind of to be given permission to do that, so we're not stepping over the line. So give permission for people to kind of support or gently challenge you. You could just hit return again there. And also proactively build in these checkpoints. So we talk about regular health checks rather than emergency surgery. You know, checking in on a weekly, monthly basis, having a space to talk about anything that's coming up rather than waiting to, it's like, oh goodness, like my husband might be, she's not getting out of bed. We should have intervened about this weeks ago. You know, build it in. Don't wait until it gets to worst case scenario. And also, sorry, there's the extra bullet points aren't coming up for me there, but also there's some really lovely initiatives around peer support. And we've just been doing training for researchers in our university around this, and they're starting to connect people working on different topics, but similarly kind of difficult topics, connecting in and being a source of peer support. Because sometimes you want to talk to someone who's not your manager, who's not your supervisor, and just have that space. Okay, next slide then, just please. But as I said at the start, this is not about you needing to look after yourself. This is a collective responsibility. So what kind of thinking about what support your supervisor, your manager, your institution puts in place. You know, do they understand the nature and the impact of your work? Particularly at doctoral study, this can sometimes happen, who you have a supervisor who's not familiar with your field or your methodology and maybe doesn't understand it. So, you know, help them understand it. Do they have training? Do they understand kind of vicarious trauma and know how to look out for you? These are things that institutions need to be putting in place for managers and supervisors. A well-being offer. Are there different levels of well-being? You know, do you have access for counselling? If you need it, is there then specialist therapeutic support? And that, again, is one of the really helpful practical things that we have built in over the years. When you need something more, a small budget, that someone can actually go and get kind of a number of sessions with a trained therapist that just helps them recalibrate and be able to come back in. And from an institutional perspective, look at your ethics committees if you have them. I've just been working with our ethics committee because I just changed universities 2 years ago, and we're changing our ethics form and we're writing a guidance for people around researcher well-being being an ethical concern and starting to really systematically address it through ethics, through health and safety procedures that our universities have. Okay, just next slide then, please. So I suppose just to kind of wrap up a little bit about how do we think about these things, a really helpful kind of measure for me is there's real lessons, there's real parallels from how we think about participant well-being to how we think about ours. So that all those things you think about, choice on how to engage, breaks, diversions, being conscious of the difficulty of the ask, the importance of endings, wraparound support, these things also apply to us as researchers. So as I said earlier on, when you're thinking about participant well-being, have your parallel notes and think about our well-being and what we can do around that. Make sure that if you're managing or supervising anybody, that you're giving them a heads up that this work might have an impact on them. Sorry, if we could just go back a slide. So you're preparing them for the potential impacts of the work. Again, I often train on this, and people will say, particularly doctoral students, nobody has ever even talked to me about this. No one has said to me my work might have an impact. And that knowledge and equipping and empowering is a really important part of the process of being prepared to manage it. I talked about having experienced colleagues or supervisors on call during field work, making sure you get that debriefing that you need, looking at other options. We've talked about peer support. One of the things, practical things I find really helps me is I kind of write notes, fieldwork notes at the end of it, which are a bit like, how did I find that? What impact? Did I struggle with it? You know, just a writing out can help you process emotions as well. And as I said, the importance then of an active specialist support offer when you need more than peer and perhaps kind of institutional counselling support. So I just want to finish up by briefly showing you the model that I talked about that Bath University have developed. And you'll get the links to this. But this is essentially a kind of a bronze, silver, gold approach to how universities and institutions can improve their response to researcher wellbeing, not you as individual researchers having to do all of this yourself. And you will get the links to this in the slides. And I would really recommend you take a look at this bath model. I've been using it to kind of go to our university. Okay, let's get ourselves to bronze. Then we can look at the next stage going to silver. And the bronze is pretty much stuff you can do without cost. So they are things that most institutions should be able to do some version of. And alongside this model bath have lots of kind of templates and sample resources that you can use to try to kind of move this issue forward in your university. So I am going to wrap it up there, leave a little bit of time for any questions or reflections. Oh, sorry, I forgot one more slide. If anybody is interested, I talked about this researcher wellbeing being part of a bigger response and how we do our research. And this is a project where we've been funded to think about how we are trauma informed in our research, how we do it ethically. And there's lots of resources coming out in the next couple of months that will be on the website for free. So kind of what young people want you to think about in terms of keeping them safe in research, how we are trauma informed, how we think about researcher wellbeing. So if anyone is interested in that, you can just sign up to get the newsletter, and in a month or two, we can send you the link to that. All right, that is now me, time for questions or reflections.
Thank you so much, Dr. Helen. This was really comprehensive and insightful for our audience. We have received massive appreciation in the comments and in the meeting chat. So just to conclude, it's pivotal to ensure our own mental well-being in order to produce high impact research. We have to stay motivated, and motivation, this kind of motivation is intrinsic motivation, because mostly the research pursuits are our own brainchild. So we really can't seek motivation from external sources. It has to come from within. And to get motivation from within, we need to practice some consistency in tips and techniques that Helen has just shared with us. So Helen, as I said, that we have received massive praise for you and the strategies that you have shared. We do have some questions. The first question, which I'd like to take to you, is can researchers report this in their research, that maybe their emotional or their emotions are taking a toll on them, and that could create a bias? Is that a good idea to write it in your research, or should we just address it under the wraps?
That's a very good question. And I think it depends a little bit on the context of your research. For example, in a doctoral study, I'm examining another one on Friday, and I've just read it, and I love it when a researcher, really openly reflects on kind of the way in which this impacted, how that might have engaged, how they thought about the study, etc. So I think particularly in things like doctoral study, it's really important to do because it's part of your journey. I think it is also really important to do in other studies, but it is holding that balance of, might someone take it and then kind of use it to undermine the findings of your work. So I think if you're reflecting on it, but reflecting on it of, this is what I kind of came in with, these were the support structures and the mechanisms I put in place to manage it, then that's good to do. It's important for more of us to start sharing about this, but you don't want to do it to the extent that someone says, well, there's probably, let's just ignore your research because you were so all over the place, you probably didn't know what you were doing. So I would say yes, but do it with balance and show what support you had around you that meant that it doesn't invalidate what came out of the research.
Thank you so much. We have a range of questions asking about how should researchers decide that it's now time to detach from the research, because we time and again say that you have to, create that gap between the research and yourself. If you have a writer's block and if you are not able to produce quality work. So we have questions where people are asking if there are any strategies to decide when is a good time to take a break.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is very different for everyone. We all have different thresholds of what we can manage and when we need a break. And as I said at the start, that can also change over our careers. So, there have been, and this is where the importance of knowing your own reactions and knowing kind of the very early signs. Because for me, there was a point a number of years ago where I was like, I actually need to step back from kind of doing field work around this. It's a little difficult for me, and created that space and then felt able to come back in. But that would have looked very different for someone else. So it's about recognizing those kind of really early signs. And I am very bad at this, so I am not going from it. I'm the best person at managing this. I'm still learning. But as soon as any of those early signs start, that's when you need to be paying attention to it, when the rumblings start. But in an ideal world, if your project allows, and I know sometimes we all have ridiculous timeframes and ridiculous expectations in projects, so it mightn't be possible. But if you can, it is thinking about, I will always make sure that I have a day that I'm not doing field work every few days before I go into the other, or I will only do so many interviews in a day because that's all I can manage, or I'm going to take a week off from transcription and go and do something different. But I know the reality is that in a lot of projects, that's very difficult to do. So it is about just those very early signs. And as I said, giving someone permission to check in on you and see how you're doing. And the access to kind of clinical supervision, specialist support that I was talking about, also, if there is the option to do something like that early on, you don't need to be in crisis point to do that. And on some projects where we've been able to get funding for it, we've brought someone in to do kind of, with specialist expertise, to do prep sessions with us. So before we start having the reactions, to equip us to think about ways in which we can deal with the reactions when they start to come. But I wish I could say, here's an easy template, but it very much differs for every person. And for me, it's actually differed on every project as well.
Absolutely, I agree with you. It's something subjective. We all recognize our threshold ourselves. When you think that you're reaching that point, just take a break. And break can also mean different for different people. For some people, break can be a few hours of break from their research engagement, and for some people, depending on the urgency of product required from your research project, it can also stretch over a period of days. And this is where retreats come in. That's why researchers' retreats is a new thing, that they change your setting, they take you out of your context, put you in a context where you're surrounded by like-minded people. You don't have any distractions, and you're just supposed to write or do your thing as a researcher.
Yeah.
We have some more questions relevant to keeping the balance in terms of responsibility allocation. You did mention that we as researchers should nominate someone to run periodic checks on us. But what about the institutional support? Many people have posted that how should they cater to a low institutional support, which does not, which is not mindful of keeping a balance for the researchers.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that is far too common an experience, and it has also been my experience in the past as well. And so I think what's really good about the Bath model, and I would recommend it, is it gives you something to take to your institution and to say, we could make this one change. It won't cost you anything. Let's start to think about this. But also not to underestimate the difference that a good manager, a good supervisor, a good colleague can make. And actually what has sustained me through my career is actually working with great colleagues and having great managers who've been there for me, even when the institutional support hasn't been there. But I think the problem is that's great and it works really well, and we can support each other really well, but it's never doing that to the expense of still saying to our institutions, but you also need to do these things. And I think I suppose one of the things I haven't reflected on yet, and we're doing an online meeting here today, is I think this balance is even more difficult when we have started doing research online. So if we think about during COVID and since, it used to be I went and did my interview and I came home to my home that was my space that this didn't come into. Now we are bringing, in my case, traumatic accounts into our home. And so I think boundaries become much more difficult and more, even more important that we think about these, because you don't have that space of walking from somewhere, or traveling to start to process it. It's in your home and it's harder to be able to switch off from it. And the reality for most of us is, I'm joining you from my living room today, is that we have to do this in our living spaces. So it's little simple things as well. Can you walk outside the door for fresh air for 2 minutes? Can you do a couple of grounding techniques that just help settle you in the moment? The training we did is around a community resilience model. We had trainers in, and they were sharing really practical examples of, if you have only 2 minutes, what can you do in 2 minutes to help? As well as those wonderful things like researcher retreats and things where you have more time.
Absolutely. Great point made by you, Helen, that now the boundary between the professional and personal space has kind of merged.
Yeah.
And the same is the situation here in Pakistan. Everybody tends to take work home, and that's really integrated now, our personal life and work life, and we're always switching between both.
Yeah.
So the context really doesn't matter anymore, the physical space I'm talking about. With this, I'm just gonna thank you, Helen, for joining us. This was our first collaboration with you, and I hope that we are going to collaborate in future as well.
That would be lovely. Thank you for having me.
So for the audience, this was the last session in the series, in the research methodology series. We had 23 webinars. And in those 23 webinars, so far, we have had over 30,000 participants. And this data is coming from real-time attendance. All our sessions have gone live on YouTube. All sessions are recorded. They will always stay on our YouTube channel. You are welcome to share these resources with colleagues, with your students, with people who are interested in finding more about these crucial topics in research journey. So thank you so much. I wish you all the best. We have received so many comments, Helen, for you, thanking you that you talked about very relevant things. And I hope to see you all with another series of webinars. Until then, take care of yourself. Stay connected with us on our YouTube channel. Follow us on our LinkedIn channel so that you stay informed about the upcoming events. Thank you so much. Take good care of yourselves. Bye, Helen.